Hello again, it's Matt here from Christ the Rock once more. It's great to be able to share with you from the candle. I thought I'd give us a break from my kitchen for this week as we look at one of my favourite stories in the whole of the Old Testament, one of my favourite moments in Exodus 33. The theme for this talk is God's answer to the challenges we face. And I wonder, just before we read these coming verses, what do we want God's answer to be to our current challenges? I feel very aware that there's almost challenges coming at us from all different directions at the moment. We've got the increasing challenges of the coronavirus for many of us, both nationally but also for us personally, still very much something we're all working through. Similarly, these past couple of weeks it's become more prevalent than perhaps it's been before, of the challenges of race and inequality, and what should a just and fair society look like in the UK. And I guess for us as followers of God, one of our prayers should be not just simply what do we bring to this, but what does God bring? What is God's answer to the challenges we all go through? So we're going to be reading a few verses from Exodus chapter 33. Just to put it in context, the Israelites are in the midst of this enormous journey. This journey that began in Exodus chapter 3 with Moses being commissioned by God to go to Pharaoh and ask for and seek the freedom of his people. And it ends many, many years later in Joshua, the book later in the Bible where the Israelites finally enter the promised land. And so where we meet Moses at this moment is, I think, a similar situation to what we're currently going through, in that he has this promise of a future that God has for him, this promise of a coming blessing, and yet he is currently in the midst of challenge. And you remember last week as John looked at Exodus 32 with us, even at this moment, the people God has rescued have turned from him. They've turned towards idolatry and worshipping and serving other things. But in this wonderful passage, we see that in the midst of all these challenges, Moses is still meeting with God. And in fact, in verse 11, just before our passage today, we read that they continue to meet face to face as friends. And it's a wonderful promise for us that wherever we are, whatever we're going through, that is something we can experience too, that we can meet with God face to face as Moses did. So we're going to pick up from verse 12 and just read through to verse 17. So we start. Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me to lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You've said, I know you by name, and you've found favour with me. So if you're pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favour with you. And remember that this nation is your people." And the Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And then Moses said to the Lord, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us from here. For how will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you've asked, because I am pleased with you and know you by name." And we see, I think, in these few verses, two competing desires. We have Moses's minor request contrasted with God's great promise. So we'll start with Moses's minor request. And we see in verse 12 that Moses begins this meeting with a complaint. He says, "God, you've been telling me to lead these people, but you have not let me know who you'll send with me." And in a sense, what he's saying is, God, you've given me this task to do. You've given me this enormous challenge, but you haven't shown me exactly how to do it. And I'm sure many of us, myself included, we can echo this sentiment, can't we? This feeling of, God, you've put me in this situation for this time. And I believe you've got these promises for the future and these purposes for today, but it's just hard. And I need something from you to help me get through. And what's interesting is what Moses asks for is actually something quite specific. He says to the Lord, he said, if you're pleased with me, teach me your ways. If you're pleased with me, what I want from you as a proof of that is for you to teach me. What he's asking for really, I think, is knowledge. And again, I think for many of us, as we think of what we're currently in the midst of, whether it's the virus, whether it's our own personal circumstances with our family, our friends, our homes, whether it's how we respond to these questions of inequality and justice, what we often want is knowledge. We want answers. We want direction. I know that many of my prayers these past few weeks have been, God, show me. Show me your plans for myself and for me and Sophie. Show me the direction we should take as a church. Show me how we should respond to these really difficult questions of race. Show us, Lord. And what Moses asks for is knowledge. And to be fair, God has shown himself to do this before with Moses. Exodus chapter 20 through to 31 is essentially this deluge of knowledge from God. And across the Bible, of course, there are loads of circumstances where God's people come to him seeking direction, seeking answers, and he gives it. But not here. So Moses' request for God, his minor request is for knowledge. But God's promise to Moses, and I think one of the most awesome moments across the whole Bible, comes in verse 14, when the Lord replies, my presence will go with you. Moses wants knowledge. He wants answers. He wants direction. But God promises his presence. He says, my presence with you will be the thing that gives you rest. And just quickly, we see, I think, in these couple of verses, three aspects of God's presence. First of all, God's presence is personal. Often when we speak of the presence of God, it can seem like we're talking about this strange, ethereal, distant force. And yet God uses personal pronouns. He says, my presence. Not the presence or a presence, but my personal presence will go with you. It's interesting, the Hebrew word for presence here, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, is the word panem. And it actually, in other translations, reads as face. My face will be with you. It means, in a sense, that the personal side of God, his character, his love, his kindness, his forgiveness, the personal words of God, his words of hope and peace, they will be with Moses through this time. I think there's a reference here to the very beginning of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, where Moses is commissioned by God to go to Pharaoh. And Moses says to God, God, who am I that I should go? I'm just a mere farmer. Who am I that I'm going to be the one to approach Pharaoh? And God says, I will be with you. I will be with you. This personal relationship with God, this personal presence accompanying Moses on the journey. Secondly, God's presence was proximal. Now, truthfully, the only reason I picked the word proximal is because it also begins with P. But what it means is there is a physical closeness that comes with God's presence. Sometimes when we speak of God's presence, we speak about it as something that is everywhere, in all creation, in all time, with all people. And whilst that is theologically true, actually here, God says his point isn't so much that his presence is everywhere, but it is there. It is there with Moses. A.W. Tozer wrote about the presence of God, and particularly the presence of God with mankind and what it means. And he said these words. He says, God is present. He is near him. He is next to him. And this God sees him and knows him through and through. And it's at this point that faith begins. Everything else, all the thousands of other wonderful truths, refer back to this truth that God is here. It's a wonderful thing to think that I'm recording this in the candle on a Friday afternoon and you're watching this wherever, and yet God is with you. He's closer to me now in a sense than this green couch. He's closer to me than my shirt. He's closer to me than the hairs in my slightly greying beard. He is with us. So God's presence is personal, it's proximal, and then just lastly, it's powerful. Moses says, "What else will distinguish me and your people unless you go with us?" And it's true as we look across the whole previous story of the Israelites and as it goes forwards through to the New Testament, we see that God's people are not defined by the great leaders of the Bible. They're not defined or distinguished by their military prowess. They're particularly at this moment not defined by anything like their great wealth, because they haven't got any. What they're defined by is God's presence and God's blessing. And it's a wonderful truth for us because it means that when we face these challenges, we know that we need more than what we have. We need more than our own ideas, our own visions, our own plans. We need more than what we can bring to the table. And God's presence means that he joins us and he will powerfully provide for us and work through us. And it's a wonderful thing. But I guess all three of those things, God's presence being personal, proximal, and powerful, they're all nice ideas, but what does it mean for us on Monday morning? What does it mean when we face the challenges afresh of work and relationships and all these different things? Well, I just want to just briefly to finish offer a quick thought that I read a few days ago. I've been reading a book by someone called John Mark Comer called The Relentless Elimination of Hurry. And he makes this, I think, really quite pertinent point about the presence of God, particularly in relation to today's society. And he says that often when we speak about God's presence, our question is, God, where are you? God, where is your presence? And we question why, in a sense, we can't feel God's presence more around us. And his point is that maybe actually in a time of everything competing for our attention, whether it's news reports, social media, magazines, people, whatever, that actually the problem maybe isn't God's presence as much as it is our attention. Are we paying attention to the presence of God in our lives? When we begin our days, where is the first place we look? Do we look to God's presence? Do we remind ourselves through prayer, through his word, that he is with us? Or do we look at our phone? When we encounter challenges, where is it we turn? Do we turn to social media for that quick endorphin rush? Do we turn to the news to take our attention elsewhere? Or do we turn our attention to the presence of God with us and ask for his blessing and his direction as we go forwards? So I'm going to just pray some of these things over us as we finish. So God, like Moses, we know that we need more than what we have. We need more than our plans. We need more than our ideas. We need your presence with us. And even now, Lord, wherever we are, whether we're in our kitchen, whether in the candle, whether we're in our front room, we pray that we would just again be reminded of that wonderful truth of your presence with us, that closeness, that personal nature of you, that power that transcends all things. Remind us of this now, Lord. And Lord, like Moses, may we know that we don't just experience this presence in a moment, but we take it with us. We take it with us through today, tomorrow and onwards. So God, as Moses said, may we be people not distinguished by our own powers, our own wealth, our own plans, but may we be distinguished by your presence.